What would you do if you walked into a room where everyone immediately judged you, where laughter followed your every step, and whispers questioned your right to even be there? Most of us would turn around and leave. But what if that moment of humiliation became the catalyst for something extraordinary? Something that would silence an entire room and change hearts forever. This is the true story of Jerome "Zeke" Washington, a 72-year-old black man who shuffled into Iron Fist boxing gym on a cold February morning in 2019, wearing a faded hoodie and carrying nothing but worn hand wraps and decades of buried dreams. To the young fighters pumping iron and hitting heavy bags, he looked like someone who had wandered into the wrong place. They had no idea they were staring at a legend. What happened next would become the stuff of boxing folklore, a single moment that would expose the ugly face of both racial and age discrimination, while simultaneously revealing the unbreakable spirit of a man who refused to be defined by others' prejudices. This isn't just a story about boxing. It's about dignity, respect, and the dangerous assumptions we make about people based on their age, race, or appearance. In a world that often dismisses the elderly and continues to harbor racial biases, Jerome's story serves as a powerful reminder that champions aren't defined by the color of their skin or the number of years they've lived. They're defined by the strength of their character and the fire that burns within their hearts. Get ready to witness how one uppercut didn't just silence a room. It shattered stereotypes and restored faith in the power of the human spirit. Jerome Washington was born in 1947 in a segregated neighborhood in Detroit, Michigan, where the sound of factory whistles mixed with the constant hum of racial tension. The son of a factory worker and a seamstress, Jerome grew up in an era when being a young black man meant navigating a world that constantly reminded you of your place. But inside the walls of Murphy's boxing gym on the east side of Detroit, Jerome found something different, a sanctuary where respect was earned with sweat and heart, not inherited through privilege. The early 1960s were a time of profound change in America. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum, but for young black athletes, sports became more than just games. They became battlegrounds for dignity and recognition. Boxing, in particular, carried special significance in the black community. It was a sport where a man could literally fight for his respect, where legends like Joe Louis had broken barriers decades earlier, paving the way for future generations. Jerome's introduction to boxing came at age 12, not through choice, but necessity. After being targeted by neighborhood bullies who saw his quiet demeanor as weakness, his father marched him down to Murphy's gym. "Son," his father said, "the world ain't always gonna be fair to people who look like us. But in there, your fists do the talking, and they don't see color. They just see skill." The gym was a revelation for young Jerome. Here, under the watchful eye of trainer Big Mike Murphy, a former heavyweight contender who had faced his own share of discrimination. In the 1940s, Jerome discovered he had natural talent. His footwork was smooth, his combinations crisp, and his left hook could drop opponents twice his size. But more importantly, he learned about respect, discipline, and the unspoken code of the boxing community. What happened in the ring stayed in the ring, and everyone bleed the same color. The Golden Gloves tournament was the pinnacle of amateur boxing in the 1960s and 70s, a proving ground where future champions were forged. For a young black fighter from Detroit's East Side, making it to the Golden Gloves was like reaching for the stars. Jerome's journey through the amateur ranks was meteoric. He won his first 23 fights, 18 by knockout, earning him the nickname Silent Thunder for his quiet demeanor outside the ring and explosive power within it. The year 1973 marked the apex of Jerome's amateur career. At the National Golden Gloves Championship in Kansas City, he faced the toughest competition of his life. The boxing world was still grappling with racial integration, and black fighters often faced additional scrutiny and discrimination from judges and officials. Jerome knew he couldn't just win. He had to dominate to avoid any controversial decisions, and dominate he did. His path to the championship was a masterclass in boxing technique and mental fortitude. In the semifinals, He faced Tommy the Hurricane O'Brien, a heavily favored Irish-American fighter from Boston, who had never lost an amateur bout. The crowd was clearly behind O'Brien, but Jerome remained focused. In the third round, with the fight tied on the scorecards, Jerome unleashed a perfectly timed uppercut that lifted O'Brien off his feet and into boxing immortality. The 1973 Golden Gloves Championship was more than just a tournament victory, it was a statement. Jerome Washington had not only won the most prestigious amateur boxing title in America, but he had done so while carrying the hopes and dreams of a community that had long been marginalized. His victory was celebrated in barbershops, churches, and community centers across Detroit, where his photograph was displayed with pride alongside other local heroes. Following his Golden Gloves triumph, Jerome turned professional with dreams of following in the footsteps of Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier. His professional record was unblemished, 12 wins, all by knockout, and boxing insiders began whispering about a potential title shot. But life, as it often does, had other plans. February 15th, 2019 started like any other winter morning in Chicago. The snow crunched beneath Jerome Washington's worn boots as he approached the glass doors of Iron Fist Boxing Gym, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. At 72 years old, Jerome moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body carried decades of stories, some triumphant, others painful. In his weathered hands, he clutched a small gym bag containing his most precious possessions, a pair of faded leather boxing gloves and hand wraps that had seen better days 50 years ago. The gym was bustling with morning activity. Young fighters, most in their 20s and 30s, were scattered throughout the space, some shadowboxing in front of mirrors, others pounding heavy bags with rhythmic precision, and a few engaged in technical sparring sessions. The atmosphere was charged with testosterone, ambition, and the kind of youthful arrogance that comes from believing you're invincible. Jerome paused at the entrance, taking in the familiar sounds and smells that transported him back half a century. The rhythmic thud of gloves against leather, the shuffle of feet on canvas, the sharp exhale of breath with each thrown punch. It was a symphony he had once conducted with masterful precision. But now, as he stood in the doorway of this modern gym with its pristine equipment and bright fluorescent lighting, he felt like a ghost from another era. The first snickers came from a group of young fighters near the free weights. "Hey, check out Grandpa," one of them whispered loud enough for others to hear. "I think the senior center is down the street, old man." The comment drew chuckles from nearby fighters, and Jerome felt the familiar sting of judgment. The same feeling he had experienced countless times throughout his life, though now it was his age, rather than his race, that made him a target. Marcus "Thunder" Johnson, a 28-year-old light heavyweight with an unblemished record and championship aspirations, was holding court near the main training area. At 6'2", with a chiseled physique and gold teeth that gleamed when he smiled, Marcus was the gym's golden boy, charismatic, talented, and unfortunately, blessed with the kind of arrogance that comes from never having faced real adversity. When he spotted Jerome slowly making his way toward the heavy bags, Marcus saw an opportunity for entertainment. Yo, Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the gym and drawing attention from other fighters. "Look what we got here. Moses wandered into the wrong building." The comment sent ripples of laughter throughout the gym, and Jerome felt dozens of eyes turn toward him. Some faces showed amusement, others embarrassment, but none showed the respect that had once been afforded to warriors who had paid their dues in the ring. Jerome's jaw tightened, but he continued walking toward an empty heavy bag in the corner. He had survived far worse than the taunts of ignorant young men. Growing up in 1950s Detroit, he had faced genuine hatred and systemic racism that made these comments seem trivial by comparison. But there was something particularly cutting about being dismissed as irrelevant, as if his years of experience and accomplishment meant nothing because his hair was gray and his hands showed the wear of 7 decades. "Excuse me, sir," came a voice from behind him. Jerome turned to see Danny Rodriguez, the gym's trainer, a former professional boxer who had fought in the 1990s before a hand injury ended his career. Danny was one of the few people in the gym old enough to remember when boxing was about more than social media followers and flashy personalities. Are you looking for someone? Because if you're here about membership, we should probably talk about our senior citizen discount program. The condescension in Danny's voice was subtle but unmistakable. He wasn't being cruel like Marcus, but his assumption that Jerome was some confused old man who had wandered into the wrong place was equally insulting. Jerome looked Danny in the eye, a steady, unwavering gaze that hinted at depths the younger man couldn't fathom. "I'm here to train," Jerome said simply. His voice was quiet but carried an authority that momentarily silenced the immediate area around them. Marcus, however, wasn't about to let the moment pass. "Train?" he laughed, slapping his knee theatrically. "Pops, the only thing you should be training for is a wheelchair marathon. This ain't bingo night at the community center." The gym erupted in laughter, and even some of the more respectful fighters cracked smiles at Marcus's crude joke. Jerome began unwrapping his hand wraps, movements that were smooth and practiced despite his age. As he methodically wrapped each hand, the laughter began to die down slightly. There was something about the ritual, the precision of his movements, that suggested this wasn't his first time preparing for battle. "Danny," Marcus called out to the trainer, "you gonna let Captain Social Security here hurt himself on your equipment? What's his insurance situation looking like?" More laughter echoed through the gym, but Jerome noticed that some of the older fighters, men in their 40s who understood that time was undefeated, weren't laughing anymore. As Jerome approached the heavy bag, Marcus decided to escalate the situation. "Tell you what, old man," he said, jumping up from his bench and strutting toward Jerome. "How about we make this interesting? You want to train so bad, let's see what you got. Put some gloves on and show us these moves you probably learned when boxing was still legal in black and white." The gym fell silent. What had started as casual mockery had just crossed a line into something more serious. Challenging someone to spar, even an elderly man, carried weight in the boxing community. It was an invitation to settle matters the way fighters had always settled them, with skill, heart, and fists. Jerome looked at Marcus for a long moment, studying the young man's face. He saw arrogance, yes, but also insecurity masked by bravado. He saw a fighter who had never been truly tested, who had never faced someone who could teach him the difference between talent and wisdom. "You sure about that, son?" Jerome asked, quietly. "Dead sure, Grandpa. Let's see if you can still remember how to throw a punch without breaking a hip." The crowd gathered closer as Danny reluctantly retrieved sparring gloves and headgear. The tension in the gym was palpable. Half the fighters were anticipating an entertaining beatdown, while others felt uncomfortable about what was clearly going to be an unfair mismatch. None of them could have predicted that they were about to witness a moment that would change their understanding of respect, wisdom, and the true meaning of being a fighter. As Jerome slipped on the sparring gloves, his transformation was subtle but unmistakable. His posture straightened slightly, his movements became more fluid, and something flickered in his eyes, a fire that had been banked but never extinguished. The years between Jerome's professional boxing career and that fateful morning at Iron Fist Gym were marked by struggles that would have broken lesser men. After retiring from boxing in 1976, with an undefeated professional record, Jerome believed he was walking away temporarily, just long enough to address a family crisis that demanded his immediate attention. He never imagined that temporary hiatus would stretch into decades of silence, obscurity, and a battle against systemic barriers that seemed designed to erase his legacy. The crisis that pulled Jerome away from boxing was his younger brother Marcus, who had been arrested on drug charges in Detroit's increasingly dangerous East Side. As the crack epidemic swept through urban America in the late 1970s, it devastated black communities with surgical precision, destroying families and criminalizing entire generations. Jerome's brother was facing a lengthy prison sentence that would effectively end his life before it truly began. Using his boxing prize money and mortgaging his future, Jerome hired the best lawyer he could afford, and became his brother's primary advocate. The system wasn't built for people like us to succeed, Jerome would later reflect. They'd rather see a black man in handcuffs than holding championship belts. The legal battle consumed not only Jerome's financial resources, but also his prime fighting years. While contemporaries like Sugar Ray Leonard and Thomas Hearns were ascending to superstardom, Jerome was sitting in courtrooms, visiting his brother, in county jail, and watching his boxing dreams slip away with each passing month. The racial dynamics of 1970s America added another layer of complexity to Jerome's struggles. Boxing had a long history of discrimination against black fighters, and the sport's power brokers were predominantly white men who controlled access to major fights and title opportunities. Without a powerful promoter or the financial backing, to wait for opportunities, Jerome found himself on the outside looking in. Phone calls went unreturned, and promises of future fights evaporated like morning mist. They told me I was too old at 29, Jerome remembered with bitter irony. Too old, too black, too independent. I wouldn't play their games, wouldn't let them control my career, so they froze me out. The boxing establishment's subtle but effective blacklisting of fighters who didn't conform to their expectations was a form of institutional racism that rarely made headlines, but destroyed countless careers. When his brother was finally released, after serving 3 years, Jerome tried to mount a comeback, but the boxing world had moved on. His name, once whispered in the same breath as future champions, was now forgotten. Promoters who had once courted him now claimed they had never heard of him. The Golden Gloves championship that had once opened doors became a faded memory, meaningful only to those who had witnessed it firsthand. Economic necessity forced Jerome into a series of jobs that utilized his physical strength, but ignored his intellect and talent. He worked construction during the day and picked up evening shifts at a warehouse, his hands, once instruments of artistry in the ring, now calloused from manual labor. The work was honest, but soul-crushing for a man who had once stood on the verge of greatness. The most painful part of Jerome's exile from boxing wasn't the financial hardship. It was the erasure. In an era before the internet, when boxing history was preserved primarily through newspaper clippings and word of mouth, fighters who disappeared from the scene could vanish entirely from the sport's collective memory. Jerome's achievements became ghost stories, his name absent from record books that didn't bother documenting minor tournaments or insignificant fighters. I'd watch fights on television and see guys I had beaten as amateurs getting title shots, Jerome recalled. I'd sit in my living room, working a beer and wondering what might have been if I'd been born a different color, or if I'd been willing to compromise my principles. The psychological toll of unrealized potential weighed heavily on Jerome as he aged. He developed what he would later recognize as depression, though mental health resources for black men in urban communities were virtually non-existent in the 1980s and 90s. His marriage suffered under the strain of financial pressure and his own sense of failure. When his wife left in 1989, taking their teenage daughter with her, Jerome hit rock bottom. For nearly a decade, Jerome avoided anything related to boxing. He couldn't watch fights on television without feeling a mixture of pride and regret. He stored his gloves and trophies in a closet, unable to look at them but unwilling to throw them away. The sport that had once defined his identity became a source of pain too great to bear. The path back to boxing began in his 60s, when Jerome started volunteering at a community center in Chicago, where he had moved to be closer to his daughter and grandchildren. Working with young people, many of whom reminded him of his younger self, reignited something he thought was permanently extinguished. These kids faced many of the same challenges he had encountered: poverty, discrimination, limited opportunities, and a society that seemed designed to ensure their failure. I realized I had been so focused on what boxing had taken from me that I forgot what it had given me, Jerome reflected. It taught me discipline, respect, perseverance. It showed me that with enough heart and determination, you could overcome anything. These kids needed to learn those lessons. Jerome began informally coaching at the community center, teaching basic boxing techniques to teenagers who had never heard of the Golden Gloves but desperately needed the structure and confidence that boxing could provide. Word of his skill and knowledge spread slowly through Chicago's South Side, and eventually, former fighters who remembered his name began seeking him out. It was through these connections that Jerome learned about Iron Fist Gym, a place where serious fighters trained, where champions were made. At 72, he decided it was time to return to his roots, not as a comeback fighter, but as a man reclaiming his identity and demanding the respect his lifetime of achievement had earned. The decision to walk into that gym wasn't made lightly. Jerome knew he would face skepticism, possibly ridicule, but he also knew that he had something valuable to offer. Not just knowledge, but living proof that champions are forged not just by talent, but by character, resilience, and the refusal to let others define your worth. The moment Jerome's gloved hands touched leather, something shifted in the atmosphere of Iron Fist Gym. What had started as cruel entertainment was about to become an education in humility, respect, and the dangerous assumptions we make about others based on their appearance. Marcus Thunder Johnson bounced on his toes, shadowboxing with exaggerated movements designed to intimidate and entertain the growing crowd of spectators. At 6'2" and 180 pounds of sculpted muscle, he looked like a Greek statue come to life, young, powerful, and seemingly invincible. His gold teeth caught the fluorescent lights as he grinned at his audience, confident that the next few minutes would provide enough material for social media posts and gym legends for years to come. Jerome, meanwhile, stood quietly in his corner, methodically checking his gloves and stretching muscles that hadn't seen serious action in decades. His movements were economical, purposeful, the ritualistic preparation of a man who had done this thousands of times before. Some of the older fighters in the gym began to notice something familiar in Jerome's stance, the way he held his hands, the subtle shift of his weight from foot to foot. "Keep it light, boys," Danny Rodriguez called out, though his voice betrayed his nervousness about the situation. "This is just for fun." But everyone in the gym understood that nothing in boxing was ever just for fun. Pride, respect, and reputation were always on the line. The two fighters touched gloves in the center of the ring, and Marcus couldn't resist one final taunt. "Try not to have a heart attack, Grandpa," he whispered with a smirk. Jerome looked directly into Marcus's eyes and spoke quietly enough that only the younger fighter could hear. "Son, I've been having this conversation with disrespectful young men since before you were born. The result is always the same." The sparring session began with Marcus dancing around the ring, throwing lazy jabs and combinations that were more flash than substance. He was putting on a show, playing to the crowd that had gathered to watch what they expected to be a one-sided beatdown. His punches came with telegraphed wind-ups and were thrown at half speed, the kind of tentative offense you might use against a child or someone you didn't want to seriously hurt. Jerome, however, was studying Marcus with the intensity of a chess grandmaster analyzing his opponent's opening moves. Every feint, every step, every shift in weight was catalogued and analyzed. His own movements were minimal but precise. Small steps, subtle head movements, hands held in a classic defensive position that spoke of decades of training and experience. The first minute, the crowd continued to chuckle as Marcus played with his elderly opponent, but gradually, those with trained eyes began to notice something unusual. Jerome wasn't getting hit. Despite Marcus's youth and speed, every punch was sliding past its target by inches. More importantly, Jerome was beginning to time Marcus's rhythm, slipping punches with micro-movements that spoke of exceptional ring intelligence. "This old dude's got some moves," someone whispered from ringside. Marcus, growing frustrated by his inability to land clean shots on someone he perceived as an easy target, began to increase his intensity. His punches came harder and faster, but with each escalation, Jerome's defense became more apparent. The old man was making the young champion look amateurish, avoiding punches with minimal effort while maintaining perfect balance and position. Then, it happened. Marcus, eager to end the embarrassment, threw a wild overhand right, the kind of looping punch that amateur fighters use when they abandon technique for power. As the punch came toward him, Jerome's body moved with muscle memory that had been dormant but never forgotten. He stepped slightly to his left, allowing Marcus's punch to sail harmlessly past his head, and in the same fluid motion, Jerome pivoted on his back foot and drove his left hand upward in a perfect uppercut. The punch traveled no more than 8 inches, but it carried the accumulated power of decades of training, the precision of thousands of hours of practice, and the quiet authority of a true champion. Jerome's glove caught Marcus flush on the point of his chin, lifting the younger man's feet momentarily off the canvas and sending him backward in a stumbling dance that ended with him sitting down hard on the ring floor. The gym fell completely. Marcus wasn't knocked unconscious. The punch had been delivered with control rather than malicious intent. But he was clearly stunned, both physically and mentally. He sat on the canvas, shaking his head in disbelief, trying to process how a 72-year-old man had just put him on the floor with what appeared to be a casual flick of the wrist. Jerome stepped back and lowered his hands, his face showing no triumph or gloating, only the calm satisfaction of a lesson delivered and received. In that moment, every person in Iron Fist Gym understood they had just witnessed something extraordinary, not just a physical demonstration of skill, but a masterclass in dignity, respect, and the timeless truth that a true champion's greatest victories often come not from defeating opponents but from educating them. The silence that followed Jerome's uppercut stretched for what felt like an eternity. Marcus sat on the canvas, his pride bruised more severely than his jaw, while the gathered crowd processed what they had just witnessed. The elderly black man they had dismissed as an easy target had just delivered a masterclass in boxing technique, humility, and quiet dignity. Danny Rodriguez was the first to break the silence, rushing to check on Marcus, while simultaneously staring at Jerome with a mixture of awe and confusion. Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jerome calmly began removing his gloves, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "Name's Jerome Washington," he said quietly. "Most folks used to call me Silent Thunder back when I was active." He paused, meeting the eyes of fighters throughout the gym. 1973 Golden Gloves national champion, turned professional, went 12, and all knockouts before life got in the way. The reaction was immediate and electric. Several of the older fighters in the gym, men in their 40s and 50s who knew boxing history, suddenly straightened up with recognition. "Holy shit," one of them breathed. "Silent Thunder Washington. I heard stories about you from my trainer when I was coming up." Marcus, still sitting on the canvas, looked up at Jerome with new eyes. The arrogance and mockery had been replaced by something else, respect born from being humbled by superior skill and experience. I didn't know," he stammered. "I'm sorry, Jerome extended his hand to help Marcus to his feet. "Son, there's no shame in not knowing something. The shame comes from refusing to learn when the lesson is offered." His voice carried no anger or resentment, only the patient wisdom of someone who had faced far worse challenges than the ignorant taunts of young fighters. As Marcus accepted the helping hand and rose to his feet, something fundamental shifted in the dynamic of the gym. Word spread quickly through the fighters and trainers present that they were in the presence of boxing royalty, a legitimate champion whose career had been derailed by circumstances beyond his control rather than any lack of ability. "Mr. Washington," Danny Rodriguez said, his tone now respectful and eager, Would you be interested in working with some of our fighters? We could use someone with your experience and knowledge." Jerome looked around the gym, taking in the faces that had been mocking him just minutes before. Now those same faces showed curiosity, respect, and in some cases, genuine remorse for their earlier behavior. "I might be able to help out," he said slowly. "But understand this, in my gym, we don't judge people by what they look like on the outside. We judge them by what they show us in here." He tapped his chest. "And in there," he pointed to the ring. Over the following weeks, Jerome became a fixture at Iron Fist Gym. His transformation from target of ridicule to respected elder statesman happened gradually but definitively. Young fighters who had laughed at his appearance now sought his advice on technique, strategy, and mental preparation. His quiet wisdom and obvious skill earned him the respect that his age and race had initially denied him. Marcus, in particular, became one of Jerome's most dedicated students. The young fighter's humbling experience had opened his eyes to his own arrogance and ignorance. Under Jerome's tutelage, Marcus not only improved as a boxer, but grew as a person, learning that true strength comes not from dominating others, but from lifting them up. The story of what happened at Iron Fist Gym spread throughout Chicago's boxing community and beyond. Social media posts and word-of-mouth accounts turned Jerome's moment of triumph into an inspiration for countless people who had faced discrimination based on their age, race, or appearance. His story became a powerful reminder that everyone has a story worth knowing, and that our assumptions about others often reveal more about our own limitations than about theirs. Jerome never sought the spotlight that his gym incident brought him. He was content to train fighters, share his knowledge, and serve as a living example that champions are made not just by physical gifts, but by character, resilience, and the refusal to let others define their worth. In a world too quick to judge and dismiss, Jerome Washington had reminded everyone that respect is earned. Wisdom comes with experience, and sometimes the most powerful punch is the one that teaches rather than destroys. Jerome Washington's story at Iron Fist Gym is more than just an inspiring tale of an elderly man proving his worth to disrespectful young fighters. It's a mirror held up to our society, reflecting the ugly reality of how we treat people who don't fit our narrow definitions of relevance or value. In those few minutes of sparring, Jerome didn't just deliver a perfectly timed uppercut. He delivered a powerful lesson about the dangers of prejudice, the importance of respect, and the timeless truth that everyone has something valuable to offer. The laughter that filled Iron Fist Gym when Jerome first walked through those doors represents something much larger than the ignorance of a few young fighters. It represents the systemic dismissal of the elderly, the persistent stereotypes about black men, and the dangerous assumption that worth is determined by appearance rather than character. Jerome's response, patient, dignified, and ultimately triumphant, offers a blueprint for how to confront discrimination with grace and strength. In our age of social media snap judgments and instant conclusions about others, Jerome's story reminds us to pause before we laugh, to listen before we speak, and to remember that every person we encounter carries within them a lifetime of experiences, achievements, and wisdom that we know nothing about. The next time you see someone who doesn't fit your expectations, remember Silent Thunder Washington and ask yourself, what story might this person have to tell? What lessons might they have to teach? What assumptions am I making that say more about me than about them? True champions, as Jerome proved that day, don't just win fights. They change hearts, challenge prejudices, and remind us all that respect is not given based on age or appearance, but earned through character, dignity, and the courage to stand up when others try to tear you down. The uppercut that silenced the room was just the beginning. The real victory was what happened next. A community learned, hearts changed, and respect was restored where it had been denied. Remember to like, share, and subscribe if this story moved you. And more importantly, remember to treat every person you meet with the respect and dignity they deserve, because you never know when you might be standing in the presence of greatness.